Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, you've brought us to, well, one of the most compressed and absolutely pivotal moments of the Second World War. We're looking at just 3 months, October, November, and December of 1942.
That's right. It's a fascinating period because for so long, 1942 is seen as this high watermark for the Axis powers. But if you really zoom in on these 90 days, you see everything start to change.
And the sources you've given us really paint a stark picture. A world living under what they call a reign of fear and terror. Hitler and Japan had, effectively divided the globe.
They really had. I mean, going into this period, the German war machine looked unstoppable. They were deep inside the Soviet Union, fighting street by street in Stalingrad.
And pushing into the Caucasus Mountains, right? Threatening the oil fields.
Exactly. And at the same time, you have Rommel in North Africa, barely 60 miles from the Suez Canal. Meanwhile, the Japanese Empire was just vast. It stretched from Burma all the way to the Aleutian Islands off Alaska. The scale is just staggering to think about.
It is. So the world is in crisis. But our mission for this deep dive is to focus on what shifted. Specifically, how the unity of the Allies, the Soviet Union, America, Britain, how that coordination finally sparked hope.
It's really the story of 3 simultaneous counteroffensives. These operations were thousands of miles apart, but they all converged in these few months to completely change the war's trajectory.
So we're going to connect the dots between North Africa, the Eastern Front, and the Pacific.
Exactly. We'll look at Operation Torch and El Alamein, then the encirclement at Stalingrad, and finally the shift from defense to offense for the U.S. at Guadalcanal. By the end of this period, the Axis isn't just attacking anymore, they are desperately reacting.
Okay, let's unpack this. It feels right to start in the Pacific, even with the Allies' Europe First policy. The sheer size of this new Japanese empire demanded some kind of immediate response, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The U.S. knew they had to move from a purely defensive posture to an offensive one. And their focus, it zeroed in on the Solomon Islands, specifically Guadalcanal.
And this wasn't just a random choice. This was driven by some serious strategic thinking.
Oh, very serious. It was largely driven by Admiral Ernest King. He was a major voice in the U.S. Navy. And he insisted really vehemently that they had to attack Guadalcanal, and they had to do it now.
Why? What was the big deal about this one island?
An airfield. The Japanese were building an airfield there, and King saw immediately what that meant.
And the strategic threat of that airfield? I mean, what could it do?
Well, it was a game changer. A fully operational airfield there would allow Japanese long-range bombers to hit Australia. But even more critically, it would threaten to completely sever the sea routes, the supply lines between America and Australia.
So all the troops, all the supplies heading that way.
They'd be cut up. It would have crippled any future Allied counterattack in the Pacific. So King's argument basically won the day. Even with Europe first, this had to happen.
And so on August 7th, 1942, it begins. The first major American amphibious landing of the Pacific War. This is a huge statement, isn't it?
Yeah.
America is now on the attack.
A huge statement and the beginning of one of the most grueling, just awful campaigns of the entire war.
The sources really emphasize the conditions. Brutal doesn't even begin to cover it.
No, it doesn't. You have to imagine these long, bitter battles fought in these dark, humid, suffocating jungles. In many ways, the environment itself was a more dangerous enemy than the Japanese.
The diseases, right?
Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery. Our sources say they caused more casualties than combat. The Marines were fighting jungle rot, exhaustion, and starvation just as much as they were fighting enemy soldiers.
But they did achieve one thing almost immediately that really set the course for the whole campaign.
Henderson Field. They seized the airfield in the first few days. That Japanese construction project instantly became an American airbase, and that was the fulcrum of the entire battle.
So that single asset changes everything.
Everything. The Allies could now operate aircraft from the island. The Japanese called them the Cactus Air Force, and their presence made it incredibly difficult for Japan to reinforce or resupply their own troops by sea.
The naval battles around the island were still ferocious, though. The U.S. Navy took some heavy losses.
Oh, absolutely. They lost the carrier USS Hornet in October, which was a huge blow. It proved Japan still had incredible naval striking power. But on the island itself, that tactical advantage provided by the airfield held firm.
And by December, despite all the grim fighting, the campaign was deemed a success.
It was. The weary Marines who had borne the brunt of it were finally relieved by fresh Army divisions. By February of '43, the island was fully secured.
And this was more than just taking a piece of land, wasn't it? It was a psychological turning point.
A massive one. The U.S. proved it could launch a complex amphibious assault, take a heavily defended position, and hold it against everything the enemy could throw at them. The strategic initiative in the Pacific had just passed to the Allies.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We always focus on the heat and the jungle of Guadalcanal, but 4,000 miles to the north, a totally different battle was being fought at the same time.
The Aleutian Islands, the Forgotten War.
What a contrast. Tell us about that.
Well, in June of '42, the Japanese had actually invaded and occupied two islands, Attu and Kiska, right off the coast of Alaska. It was the first time an enemy force had occupied North American soil since the War of 1812.
That must have been a huge shock. Uncomfortably close to home for the U.S. and Canada.
It was. So the U.S. responded by occupying another island, Adak, to use as a staging ground for attacks. But the enemy there was just as much the weather as it was the Japanese.
So if Guadalcanal was heat and disease,
the Aleutians were bitter cold, freezing terrain, and this persistent, thick fog that could just hang there for weeks. It made flying almost impossible, logistics a nightmare. The men suffered from frostbite and exposure just as badly as the Marines suffered from jungle rot.
And just like in the South, air power was the key.
It was. The top priority was building an airfield on Adak so they could start bombing Kiska and Attu. But the Aleutians were always seen as a secondary theater, which is why it gets that name, the Forgotten War.
But it was still strategically vital, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Securing that northern flank was crucial for protecting the American mainland and the northern Pacific sea routes. It came at a high cost, but it had to be done.
So you have these two massive efforts securing sea lanes in the Pacific. But all of this still remains subordinate to the main Allied strategy, defeat Nazi Germany.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Europe and this growing, intense pressure to open a second major front to take some of the heat off the Soviets.
The debate over where to do that was pretty fierce, as I understand.
Oh, it was. The American generals were pushing for a direct cross-channel invasion of France, Operation Sledgehammer. They wanted to strike right at Germany's heart, but the British were, let's just say, extremely wary of that plan.
And they had good reason to be, based on what had just happened in August 1942.
The Dieppe raid, yes. A tragic, bloody confirmation of their fears. It was a smaller-scale raid on the French coast, mostly with Canadian troops, and it was an absolute disaster.
The German defenses were just too strong.
Impenetrable at that point. Of the 6,000 Allied troops who went in, over 4,000 were killed, wounded, or captured in a matter of hours. It was a brutal lesson.
So that tragedy makes it crystal clear that a full-scale invasion of France is just. It's not on the table yet. They needed more time, more resources, more everything.
Correct. And so, the alternative strategy, Operation Torch, suddenly gets all the momentum. The idea was to strike not across the channel, but through what Churchill called the soft underbelly, starting in North Africa.
And the urgency for that was amplified by the crisis happening in Egypt at the exact same time.
Right. Rommel, the Desert Fox, and his Axis troops had pushed all the way to El Alamein. As we said, just 60 miles from Alexandria in the Suez Canal.
Which would have been a catastrophe. What was so vital about the Suez Canal?
It's the link between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Losing it would have opened up the route to the Middle Eastern oil fields for Hitler, and at the same time, it would have severed Britain's main supply line to its empire. It could have prolonged the war indefinitely.
The man tasked with stopping that was General Bernard Law Montgomery.
Monty.
He takes command of the 8th Army and immediately establishes this formidable defensive line. He uses a natural barrier called the Katara Depression. It's this vast, impassable salt marsh, which meant Rommel couldn't go around him. He had to attack head-on.
But Monty wasn't just thinking about defense, was he?
Not at all. His focus from day one was meticulous, systematic preparation for an overwhelming counterattack. He stockpiled everything: weapons, ammunition, fuel. He brought in new American tanks. He amassed almost 200,000 men.
And he used deception, too. I read about Operation Bertram.
A brilliant piece of work. Dummy tanks, fake pipelines, moving units around at night, all designed to convince Rommel the main attack was coming from the south, and much later than it actually was. But the real decisive factor, the thing that crippled Rommel before the battle even started, was logistics.
It always comes down to logistics. The Allied air forces, especially those flying out of Malta, were just systematically sinking Axis supply ships in the Mediterranean.
So Rommel couldn't get his fuel, his ammunition.
Barely any of it. He needed about 100,000 tons of supplies a month just to operate. By October, he was getting less than half of that. He knew he couldn't win a sustained fight, especially with the Luftwaffe tied up on the Eastern Front.
And to make matters worse for the Germans, Rommel himself gets sick and has to go on leave.
The timing was perfect for the Allies. He leaves a less capable general in charge, just as Monty is ready to spring the trap.
And that moment comes on October 23rd. The desert goes silent, and then...
And then the air is just torn apart. The largest, most sustained artillery bombardment since World War I. 900 guns firing for 15 solid minutes. The ground was literally shaking.
The battle raged for 14 days and nights.
Brutal attritional fighting. Rommel rushed back from his sick leave, but he could only watch it unfold. By November 4th, he knew he was beaten. He began his retreat, directly ignoring an order from Hitler to stand and fight to the last man.
A huge victory. And the news of it just reverberated around the world, especially in Britain.
Oh, it was a massive boost for Churchill. He'd been facing so much criticism after a long string of defeats. This was the good news they had been desperate for.
And it led to that incredibly famous quote of his.
This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning. It just perfectly captured that feeling of cautious, hard-won optimism.
And later he put it even more simply, didn't he?
He did. Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. It was that significant.
So while Montgomery is chasing Rommel across the desert, the other half of the North Africa plan, Operation Torch, is launched.
Right, November 8th. This is the massive invasion of French North Africa, Morocco, and Algeria, with the goal of seizing the key ports of Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers.
The military goal was clear, but the politics of it were a total minefield.
A diplomatic nightmare. The whole operation hinged on how the French forces stationed there, who were loyal to the collaborationist Vichy government, would react, and President Roosevelt was particularly worried about British involvement.
Because of what happened at Mers el-Kabir in 1940.
Exactly. The British attack on the French fleet, it left a very deep, very bitter wound. Roosevelt was convinced the French would fight the British on sight.
So they came up with this compromise where American troops led the main landings, and in some cases, British soldiers actually wore American flags on their uniforms.
They did. Roosevelt went to incredible lengths. He wrote a personal letter to Marshal Pétain, the Vichy leader. He even issued a proclamation trying to win over the local Arab population, calling the arriving troops American holy warriors.
But they still needed a French leader on the ground to rally support.
They did, and after a lot of backroom dealing, they settled on General Henri Giraud. He was an anti-German figure, but crucially, not Charles de Gaulle, whom the Americans found too controversial and too close to the British.
So the landings begin on November 8th. And the reaction from the French is mixed.
Very mixed. In Algiers, there's almost no resistance. In Oran, a little more. But in Casablanca, it was a real fight. A planned coup failed, and the French Navy opened fire on the American fleet.
But while all this is happening, pure chance intervenes.
The Darlan Affair. Admiral François Darlan, the most senior Vichy commander, just happens to be in Algiers visiting his sick son when the invasion kicks off.
Suddenly, Eisenhower has the one man who can actually give a credible order to all French forces right there in front of him.
And Eisenhower makes this incredibly pragmatic but hugely controversial deal. He tells Darlan he can remain in control of French North Africa if he orders an immediate ceasefire and joins the Allies.
Which means, effectively, the U.S. is sanctioning a collaborationist regime that had been enforcing Nazi laws.
Exactly. The backlash was immediate. De Gaulle was furious. The press in Britain and America was outraged. But from Eisenhower's perspective, it was a military necessity. He was facing hundreds of French planes and thousands of troops who could have turned the landings into a bloodbath.
So the deal was struck to save lives.
It was. On November 10th, Darlan ordered the ceasefire. The fighting stopped. It was an ugly compromise, but it probably saved thousands of Allied lives and secured the success of the landings.
And the political fallout was immediate. Hitler was, predictably, furious.
Livid. He saw it as the ultimate betrayal and immediately ordered his troops to occupy the rest of France, which up until then had been technically unoccupied.
Which, ironically, probably hardened French resolve against the Nazis in the long run.
It certainly did. And soon, French troops in North Africa were joining the new Allied First Army under General Kenneth Anderson, and they began this race east towards Tunis.
The grand plan was a pincer movement, right? Trap Rommel between Anderson's army from the west and Montgomery's from the east.
That was the plan. But then the weather turned against them.
The winter rains.
Torrential rains. They turned the whole of Tunisia into a quagmire. Just this deep, impassable mud. The tanks, the trucks, everything just got bogged down.
So the race to Tunis stalled.
It did, and that delay was just enough time for Hitler to rush reinforcements into Tunis. So by the time the Allies got there, The Axis had established a strong defensive line. The fight for Tunisia was going to drag on well into 1943.
Which brings us to the third major front. While the world's attention is on North Africa, the real fate of Hitler's war is being sealed in the frozen wasteland around Stalingrad.
The irony is incredible, isn't it? In early November, Hitler is on the radio boasting that Stalingrad is in our hands. He has no idea that the Soviet general, Georgy Zhukov, is secretly massing this colossal army to the north and south of the city.
And nature gives the Soviets a helping hand.
It does. The first heavy snows arrive, and crucially, the Volga River freezes solid. This creates a natural bridge, allowing the Red Army to move troops and heavy equipment across completely undetected.
And then, on November 19th, they launch Operation Uranus.
A gigantic, perfectly executed pincer movement. It wasn't an attack on the city itself, but on the weak flanks of the German 6th Army.
And those flanks weren't held by German troops, were they?
No, and that was Zhukov's genius. He knew the flanks were held by poorly equipped and less motivated Romanian and Italian armies. When the Soviet attack came, 500,000 soldiers, 15,000 tanks, those flanks just disintegrated.
The speed of it was devastating.
Unbelievable. The two Soviet pincers met up west of the city in just 4 days. 4 days. And just like that, they had slammed the door shut.
And inside the trap.
250,000 German troops of the 6th Army. Completely encircled, instantly cut off from all supplies.
This is the moment for Hitler's great blunder, isn't it?
Yeah.
The logical military move would be for them to try and break out immediately.
It would have been their only chance. But Hitler forbids it. He orders General Paulus, the commander, to stay put, to hold Stalingrad as a fortress at all costs.
And he's relying on Hermann Goering's promise that the Luftwaffe can supply this massive army entirely by air.
An utterly insane promise. Goering said they could fly in 300, maybe 500 tons of supplies a day. On their best day, they barely managed 90 tons. The combination of terrible weather, mechanical failures, and Soviet anti-aircraft fire made it an impossible task.
So the army inside the pocket begins to starve.
Starve and freeze. They run out of food, fuel for heat, and ammunition. The conditions described in the sources are just apocalyptic.
There was one last hope, though. A relief attempt.
Operation Winter Storm. It began on December 12th. A German panzer army commanded by the brilliant General von Manstein drove hard to break through to the pocket.
And they got close, didn't they?
Agonizingly close. They made great progress at first, but were stalled about 30 miles short of the pocket. Manstein pleaded with Paulus to attempt a breakout, to meet him halfway.
And Paulus refused.
He refused. Citing Hitler's direct order, he wouldn't move. The 6th Army just sat there, waiting.
And Manstein couldn't hold his position forever.
No! By Christmas Eve, facing the threat of being encircled himself, Manstein had to call off the rescue and withdraw. The 6th Army was abandoned to its fate.
That was it. The end of Hitler's dream of conquering the Soviet Union.
It was not just a military defeat, but the greatest single operational loss in German history. A wound they would never, ever recover from on the Eastern Front.
So let's just pull back and look at the convergence here. In just 90 days, at the end of 1942, you have the U.S. seizing the initiative in the Pacific.
You have the Axis completely thrown out of Egypt, and a new front opened in North Africa.
And you have the catastrophic encirclement and destruction of an entire German army at Stalingrad.
When you look at it all together, the implications are just staggering. The Axis is suddenly, and for the first time, on the defensive everywhere. The Allies have proven they can coordinate and win on a global scale. The tide had well and truly turned.
It's incredible. But, you know, as we wrap up, I want to go back to something we talked about with Operation Torch, because it raises a really profound question. I'm talking about the Darlan affair.
Yes, it's a classic, agonizing example of military necessity clashing with moral principles.
Right. Eisenhower makes this deal with a senior official from the Vichy regime, a government that was actively collaborating with the Nazis.
A regime that was implementing Nazi laws, operating concentration camps, and the Allies, for a time, propped it up.
The pragmatism is undeniable. Darlan's ceasefire saved thousands of American and British lives, period. It was a tactical masterstroke. But the moral cost, that's harder to measure, isn't it?
It is. It really forces you to confront the grim realities of total war. The ultimate goal was to destroy Nazism. Does that end justify making a temporary deal with the lesser evil to save the soldiers you need to win the larger fight?
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? To what extent does military pragmatism justify compromising your own principles? And what are the hidden costs of those necessary but ugly deals? It's a question with no easy answer.
Not at all.
A deeply complex thought to end on. Thank you for joining us for this essential deep dive into late 1942. We hope this has given you a clearer picture of how these three flashpoints came together to change the course of the war.
Thank you for having me.
If you want to dive deeper into these incredible stories, and if you want to help support the research that makes these deep dives possible, be sure to check out our War Stories merch. You can find my shop link right there in the description below. We really appreciate the support. We will see you next time.